this video we want to show you how to collect, open and eat oysters. So there are a few things you need to know when you want to collect oysters. Collecting oysters is pretty easy, honestly, but there are a few things you need to know. First, you need to familiarize yourself with the rules and regulations in the area where you want to collect oysters. There is often a limit on how many oysters you can collect. Those limits are there to protect oysters, and also if you collect more oysters than you're allowed to, you can get a hefty fine. In some areas you're also not allowed to collect any oysters or shellfish at all. So make sure you know before you go out. No one wants to pay a lot of money and get big fines for collecting oysters illegally. Second, there's one thing we learned, and that is very important. You are not allowed to chuck or open oysters straight there on the rocks and eat them at the rocks. We learned that some time ago, and there's a rule that says don't eat oysters directly at the medium they grow on. Quite hidden rule in the rule book on collecting oysters, so it's easy to miss. But I think this rule is there for two reasons. First, you don't want to leave half the oyster shell attached to the rocks, because the inside of the oyster is very smooth, and that probably prevents other oysters or new oysters from attaching to the surface to grow there. Lots of them have been chucked out already. The first reason why you shouldn't do that is for sustainability reasons, and I think the second reason for that is if a fishery officer comes to check on you how many oysters you have collected, they cannot see it if you eat them straight there on the rocks. So that is another reason for doing that. So make sure you don't chuck oysters or open oysters there on the rocks and leave half of the oyster shell attached to the rocks. So the third thing you need to know when you intend to collect oysters is that there are sometimes biotoxins in shellfish. You need to check the biotoxins alerts. There's a website set up for this, for particular areas, if there are any biotoxins in there, because you don't want to get sick from eating shellfish. So always make sure you check this website as well before you head out there. So if you want to collect oysters, you need to know where you find them, right? Oysters are filter feeders. That means they feed on plankton and other food sources that are really small and that are in the water. Harbors are a good source of food for this kind of stuff. There's always lots of sediment, lots of nutrients are dissolved in the water in harbors with muddy bottoms, and those are usually the places where you can find oysters. Normally would look for rocky outcrops in those harbors, because those oysters are called Pacific Rock Oysters, right? That means they grow on rocks normally. Sometimes they also grow on mangroves or on pieces of wood, like a log or so that might be in the water, but rocks are your best choice to find rock oysters. So obviously the time to collect oysters is at low tide. You want to go as far out as possible. That's where the bigger oysters are, and that's where also the cleaner oysters are. So check this out. Down there, tons of oysters there. Hey Shem, what have you got with you?
I've got like essential tool, a bucket. We're gonna have a bucket full of oysters soon, and hammer, little hammer, and screwdrivers.
So that's the tools you need to pry the oysters off the rocks. Quite important is also to bring a glove. Oysters are very sharp. You want to bring a glove with you so that you don't hurt yourself. So this is not as important as the fitness. Oops, can you take that one? So the screwdriver, you use it as a bit of a wedge to get underneath the oyster. Like I said earlier, you don't want to leave any oysters attached to the rocks when you harvest them. So you get under the oyster with a screwdriver and you hammer them off the rocks basically. Be careful that you don't damage any other oysters around there, because if you accidentally puncture other oysters, they won't survive. Also, when you collect those oysters, you don't want to collect all oysters in one area. So if there's a large area with oysters that you find, take a few oysters here, take a few oysters there, and make sure that there are lots of oysters left over so that they can breed and produce more oysters for the future.
And how to open this hard shell? Mark will tell you how to do it. He's an expert now.
So now that you collected yourself a whole bunch of oysters, you need to open them up, right? And when you look at those oysters, you think, Jesus, how can I open an oyster? They're like so tightly closed that looks like you can't really open them, but there is a trick to it. So first you need to get yourself an oyster shucking knife. They're easy to find in fishing shops. They're not expensive to buy. You can get by with a bait knife or something like that, but I wouldn't recommend it because it's easy to hurt yourself. So get yourself a shucking knife, and what you want to look for at those oysters, you want to look at their butt end, basically at their rear section. There's a tiny little opening. When you inspect those oysters, you can see that it's a little slit there where the oysters breathe and where they naturally open. So you want to get your shucking knife and get that in that little opening, wiggle that in there. Use a glove on your other hand so you don't get hurt by those oyster shells, and that also you get a good grip on them. Push that into that little opening, wiggle that in there, and then you twist it, and that will pop off the oyster. That will kind of cut through the muscle in the oyster that holds the oyster shells together, and it will pop it off. And with that twisting motion, it opens up and you can get rid of the top shell, and then you have the oyster in there.
This one looks so tasty. Can I have one?
Mm-hmm. It takes a little bit of practice, but after a few oysters you'll get the hang of it. Once you got your oyster open, I actually prefer to have a bucket with some salt water or seawater next to the area where I'm shucking the oysters. When you open those oysters, there's a good chance that you get some small little pieces of shell or some bit of dirt from the rocks around there in that oyster, and you don't really want to eat that, right? So after you chuck these oysters, you just rinse them off quickly in some salt water. Next thing is you just take a piece of lemon and you cut that open and you squeeze a few drops of lemon over that oyster. They're ready to eat and they're so delicious. They're really good for you, super nutritious, and if collected in the right way, they're actually also quite sustainable. That's how you open and eat oysters. Now there are a couple more ways you can eat oysters. Some people don't like to eat them raw. So Asian, what's your favorite way to eat oysters?
First, of course, straight from the shell. Second, steam them very quick on the barbecue. Third, frita or seaweed soup.
Steam the whole oysters until they open up a little bit. Take them out this way. Tastes really good as well. I didn't think they would taste, but Haitian told me that's the way they do it in Korea. And yeah, it works really good. It tastes very creamy when you steam them for a short moment, and really delicious as well. Easier to open, you don't have to chuck them. Now one thing when you collect oysters from the rocks, you'll notice is that there is often a lot of rubbish, especially if you collect oysters close to some populated areas. Well, we collected ourselves a few nice mussels and also a little bit of rubbish. So we found a fishing rod with reel and braid on it, an icky spike, some netting, fishing line, soft bait. Rubbish like old fishing lines, nets and stuff tends to get stuck in those oysters because they grow together, clump together, and there's a lot of surface for that to get stuck in there. And this is really bad for other wildlife, especially birds. They get tangled up in those fishing lines and so on. So please remove the rubbish when you go collecting oysters. You do something really good for the environment, and it feels good afterwards. And sometimes you even find something valuable. I even found a whole rod and reel in between those oysters. It was all overgrown with barnacles, but I actually salvaged the reel. It was an expensive overhead reel and I'm trying to restore that. So check out one of our future videos, see if I'm successful with it. Right, so, and guys, did you actually know when you add those rocks, there's another really delicious species that lives in these rocks. And if you want to know how to catch and cook this one, then you better watch this video up here.
Nice visuals, another gift